Well, welcome to this Doomer Optimism podcast. I'm Jim Jones, and I'm here today with Nathan Gates and Brendan Barnard. We're going to talk about narratives and storytelling, and we don't really know. We've never met before, so we're just going to see how this conversation goes. It will be a narrative, that you can be sure. So we'll see how it goes. So I'm just going to start off. I wonder if I could pass to one of you two to start the ball rolling in terms of an introduction about yourself, and why you're here today. How about Nathan? Can I start off with you?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Nate, and yeah, happy to be jumping into this. I'm kind of curious to see where it goes. I remember in the initial conversation, it was just sort of like a real general idea about narrative, and I kind of I spend a lot of my time swimming in those waters as my full-time occupation is psychotherapist, and is
Right.
seeing the way that people's lives are shaped by the stories that they tell themselves about the world and about themselves, and how durable those stories are over time, and how so much of behavior is seems to be about conforming to and behaving coherently with the stories that we tell ourselves about the world, about ourselves. So it just piqued my interest, and I thought it'd be a fun conversation to jump in on. And then at the moment, we're having this conversation. I've just kind of also been on a 4 or 5 day Twitter bender about ideology, which I do every few months. And so it might be fun too to contrast, narrative with, ideology, and what's similar and what's different. And how those ideas interact. If we get to that, I'm open, um, just to see where we go.
That sounds great. Yeah, all of those things appeal to me. Um, Brendan, how about you? What brings you here?
Yeah. Very similar. Honestly, I'm really curious to see. I think there's probably a lot of overlap between our perspectives on this, and I think that's interesting given that we've pretty much all probably independently come to some of these conclusions. And I think that's going to be really fun to feel out.
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, I mean, we've all got stories about why we're here today, and I think that's worth saying up front, isn't it? To start off, it sounds really basic, but narrative is a personal dialogue. It's a description of your journey to where you are today. So from my perspective, as you can probably tell by the accent, I'm an Englishman living in Canada, which probably isn't that unusual, I guess. I'm an ecologist by background. I worked in wildlife conservation in the UK for a wildlife trust for about 15 years before I came over here. And I was invited to come over by a University of Waterloo professor to teach hedge laying, and that itself is a story, really, but which maybe I'll introduce at other times. But I've been interested in narratives since my time at Waterloo at the Wildlife Trust, partly because um, the work that I did there was involved with the conservation of endangered species and endangered landscapes. But what I found was that more important to my work was actually the conversations and the narratives, if you like, about that people had about their connection to the landscape, about their connection to nature. Um, and I could be talking to people about the importance of biodiversity, or the importance of, preserving ecosystem services, using the buzzword of the day. And a small portion of the audience would get me, and quite a lot of them wouldn't. And it seemed to me that rather than bringing my own narrative to the table, it was important to understand wherever everyone else was in the first instance. You know, what was their narrative. So yeah, so that's where I sort of begun my narrative journey, if you like. And since then, I've been exploring more about narratives, and especially their use as a tool for social transition and community enhancement. And you know, I've loved being associated with Doomer Optimism as well. There are some fantastic podcasts which you know, are out there full of really interesting narratives going forward. So I thought we'd maybe start really by just, you know, getting an understanding of what, you know, getting on the same page about narratives. I mean, Nate, you've already suggested that you have an understanding, a kind of interpretation of what narratives are. Do you want to comment a bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, it's a really pretty, I mean, it's a pretty broad, you know, just a pretty general statement that, you know, they're kind of constructed, their story, you know, narrative is, you know, constructed through experience. It's also socially constructed through interaction, through the culture that one's embedded in, you know, and all kinds of you know, all those sort of mediating factors. You know, you might have that narrative influenced by your physical environment, but it comes out as the story that you tell yourself and other people. I mean, there actually is probably slightly different. There's different stories, right? There's the story you tell yourself about yourself, and there's the story you might tell other people about yourself, and then there's the story you tell yourself about the world, the story you adopt about how the world is, about your place in it. Like, this is how it's how we talk to each other and how we talk to ourselves, you know, in story, in this sort of like, you know, sort of like chronologically flowing way of describing our world, and that's sort of how we make sense of things at a base level, I think.
Yeah, I would definitely agree there. I tend to split it up into a couple of different like timescales. So I tend to think of narrative of the present as our just sense making faculty, what's happening right now, and that obviously has some filters on it. And then from there, it kind of folds into our like main, I would say, narrative ability, which is, what does that thing that's happening mean? What is that present part of? And then there's, you know, the side of it that's just lying, which is, you know, what are we pretending to ourselves that means? Either on a conscious or an unconscious level.
Yeah, I hear you. You know, one of my favorite quotes is by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, and his quote, "What am I to do?" You can only answer that by saying, "What story or stories do I find myself a part of?" And I think that quote really encapsulates for me the whole idea that, you know, we are the sum of the stories that exist around us. And I you know, I think I've been doing a lot of reading for this PhD I'm doing on sustainability, and I'm looking at sort of narratives and their importance in sustainability transitions. And it really has been underlined to me that the fact that, you know, narratives are a way of exploring our world, because we don't really understand, we can't really understand our world without narratives, because, you know, there's a material world that we perceive, but we don't know the truth about that material world. We only know what our perceptions tell us about that world. So in one instance, you know, in one instance, like picking up a screwdriver or an axe or something like that. Our perception mediates a certain awareness about that tool, and it's in the immediate sense. So, but we also, like you were saying, Nathan, we were always sorry, we all also have this kind of larger scale experience of meaning behind that perception. So there's this kind of culture and society and individual and societies and individuals create cultures which mediate a large background of meaning onto that sensory experience. So there's this kind of tension and dialogue between what we're doing in the moment and also what has brought us to that moment as well, I think. Okay, oops. Something happened to the internet. And so we are back. It's my internet, unfortunately. We are back and continuing the conversation.
I was bringing up the idea of truth too, and how often rigidly, like stories, our own stories, we cling to them so much as though like there's this a literal truth to it, and which can be very problematic, because stories are representations, right? And when we put too much of the weight of truth on it, it just really can cause us to not adapt very well to our life, to other people, for society to adapt. It really makes, I guess, insensitive to the context in which one sits when somebody holds too tightly to the literal truth of a story, and it can't be adapted to changing conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's part of the understanding the structure of a story and where it's come from, that it's a representational artifact of reality. It's not reality itself. In fact, it's arguable, and philosophers have argued that we can't know, that we don't know the real world. We only know our knowledge of the real world. So narratives are a way of navigating our way through a collected and shared truths.
Yeah, there's that whole like sensory layer of reality that we're accessing through just electrical impulses in our body, and then that's kind of what I refer to as the sense making side, and that is probably the closest thing that we can all guarantee that we share. And then we build our narratives on top of that filter it again. And then there's also an interplay there where you start to get into some of the like cognitive behavioral side, where what we think about actually affects how much of our reality we can see. And that's pretty fascinating to me.
Yeah. So if we think about like, if we tie this to, directly and just kind of like to Doomer Optimism, right? It's Doomer Optimism podcast. We're all interested in that. And so there's a particular story that a lot of us who have been drawn to that, it's not maybe a super specific one, but a general story of some vague sense of collapse, for some more specific than others, but like there's like problems, either ecological, cultural, whatever, some vague sense of that, and then a turn in the story from pure doom to sort of like changing, writing different stories of adaptation and of engagement in a different way, and kind of the human capacity for change and adaptation, as opposed to just this either nothing's happening, stick our heads in the sand, or basically somebody needs to fix something pretty quick. Somebody else needs to fix something, invent something, make something different, because we're all just out of luck here.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is I'm glad you steered us towards that. Really, that kind of understanding of how narratives fit up with Doomer optimism, because it's really been on my mind quite a lot. How narratives really help us. What I've been tweeting about narratives and the importance of narratives, with the Doomer optimism hashtag for a while now, and I expect a lot of people are going, so, because I think one of the really interesting things about the podcasts that have been coming out is that there's so many different approaches to this kind of collapse and recovery narrative, which is what it is in reality. We haven't come to a collapse. We just have this narrative that we are approaching a collapse. And the Rupert Reed, who's a professor over in England, and he's been one of the Extinction Rebellion, scientific advisors to Extinction Rebellion. He's got this kind of three narratives about collapse, really, and he calls it like dodo, butterfly, phoenix. The idea that, okay, in a dodo future, we're going to have a collapse and then nothing. there's going to be no impetus to reorganize, or perhaps even the human race is going to completely disappear. You have after that the phoenix, so we are going to go through this collapse, and then but then we're birthed into a new future, perhaps looking the same or perhaps being slightly different. But then I guess the butterfly scenario is the one that we all hope for to a certain extent, is that we don't go through this collapse. We are going to transform ourselves through various through various means into a new society. And what that may look like, you can listen to any of the Doomer Optimism podcasts and get different kind of ideas being channeled through different people. I was particularly interested in one recently, which was the eco-socialism versus the kind of diffuse capitalism represented by regenerative finance, and to some extent they seem like opposite narratives. So yeah, I wonder what you guys think about the how these kind of different ideas might operate in terms of narratives going forward.
Yeah, those are interesting frames.
Yeah.
I appreciate that there's more than two, because that seems to be a problem right now.
Yeah.
We have an either or situation for most narrative constructions. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, you're right. Like every single person who's part of this rough constellation has taken a different path, and I think that definitely informs the vision of what they're doing and what they're part of. I think it's interesting that we all managed to cohere, at least approximately, despite clear differences when you get down to the really, really, really fine detail level of what people are preparing for, what they hope comes after. I would expect to see more division, and I think it's really pretty cool that there hasn't been like an actively schismatic vibe.
Yeah, but I mean that could definitely possibly happen, because people are opposed in their way that they look at the world. And I think perhaps something that you mentioned earlier on, Nate, about ideology and how that relates to narratives is really important. So for me, one of the things that I'm interested in narratives, you can look at narratives in different ways. So, but I see a division in the literature that I'm reviewing, that there's a hermeneutic tradition which is looking at texts and working out what the narratives are and feeding that back into, the study of texts and books and literature, things written down, and feeding that back into changes in society. But there's also this kind of ongoing dialogue, which is something that I'm much more interested in, because my background, as I said before, comes from that kind of active participation, where you're getting people around a table, you're having a dialogue, and they are exposing their narratives to each other, and in that moment, things change. So it's that, to me, is a kind of collective sense making going on right there. But then ideology is much more of a kind of intractable, established narrative that needs to be challenged to a certain extent, and doesn't. It's in the realm of ideas rather than the realm of active, ongoing dialogue, if you like. Would you? Yeah,
much more static.
Yeah.
I think if I was going to boil down how I see it, I would say you have the sense making side, which is what's currently happening. You have the narrative side, which is what does that mean? And then you have the ideological side, which is what should that mean? What should be happening? And it's a much more directed narrative because it's goal oriented, I would say. At least typically, people who adhere to ideologies tend to feel strongly that something should be happening that isn't. And I think so then we have that's another layer on top of the two other narrative layers. And I think that's one of the things that makes it more static, right? Is that there's what you're thinking about, there's how you're thinking it, and then there's what you think you should be thinking. And the more you stack those meta layers, the more friction there is between any given set of layers, I feel like.
Yeah, I certainly try to view this as well through the lens of systems and complexity thinking, in the sense of what do we understand by systems and complexity thinking? It's an understanding that when agents of some sort get together, they have relationships with each other, and that they relate to each other, and that the system that arises from that is very difficult to, especially when there are lots and lots of different parts, is very difficult to track through time. And to a certain extent, the other reason I'm interested in narratives is because ideology seems to me a very structural and imposed framework to head for, whereas narrative is an ongoing and organic readjustment to the conditions that exist at any one time. So it's much more open to adaptation and change in the moment. However,
it's a relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all about it's created in relationship, and it changes in a relationship. And it's it's like that game of a telephone, right? If you go around a circle and you have a short story, it changes with every interaction. It adapts to the person telling it and the person hearing it, so that it is it maintains, I think. It's funny because you say it doesn't maintain fidelity to the original story very well. But perhaps it maintains more fidelity to the individual humans who are interacting with it. So when a story can change based on based on the conditions of the person telling it, And I think that's what I enjoy so much about interacting. Just to kind of my personal process, interacting in the Doomer Optimism space, and why I kind of do go on these sort of like anti-ideological crusades now and again, because there's just a rigidity in there, and that rigidity does create schisms. That's where schisms come from. That's where splitting comes from. That's where, that's what wrecks things, is because and I feel it first in myself, because when I come into contact with an ideology, it's like, oh, you're telling me what my experience is. You're telling me how I'm supposed to see the world. And I have an instinctive, like, fuck you, get that away from me. I don't want, no, go away. So, and as opposed to hearing a story, which is sort of an invitation to participate in that story and to be curious about that story. And I think at its best, you play with stories and you co-create them, and so there's so much generativity in the process of and it can be very intentional. I'm not saying that there can't be intention put behind it. When everyone's trying to create the story, you have your vision, you want to share it, you want to make it so someone else can understand it, but then you're compelled to craft it in such a way that it can be understood. You're crafting your story in a way that people can hear it, and they give you permission to be a part of their storytelling and narrative creation, as opposed to, I'm telling you, this is how it is, and you need to agree with me, which is the most boring form of communication in the world.
Yeah, it's absolutely true, isn't it? Just like, so, I mean, this leads to something that's really, that I find another sort of researcher or philosopher that's been involved in creating the narrative paradigm, which is Walter Fisher. And he said that for a person to accept a story into their own milieu of stories, that the story has to have kind of plausibility. So it's got to be something that sounds plausible, so that's one test. But it's also got to be coherent, and by that, coherence is coherence to your own constellation of stories. And I love that word constellation as well, the constellation of stories, because that to me is what surrounds us. So, if you are in a dialogue with someone, rather than kind of, if you want to take them with you, rather than presenting your own story as you see it, you have to have a relationship with the other person in the room to understand their constellation of stories and how your story would fit in with theirs. And that to me is the most organic and kind of pleasing way of how narratives can work. Is this kind of mutual sharing of stories, and there's a certain tenderness to it as well. I have to say, this kind of, understanding somebody and their narrative constellation, and trying to take them with you on yours. But at that very moment where you share your stories, both of your stories have changed, haven't they? Because now you have opened yourself up to another person's stories in order for them to hear yours. And I really love that kind of that dance, if you like. So there's something very about that exchange that really appeals to me, and that I try and think more about when I think about the dynamics of this. Because for me, what I'm trying to get at when I think about social change and social transition for sustainability is understanding this process, because I think it's really important. But that also feeds back to the idea that this isn't going to happen quickly.
Yeah, 100%. I honestly think that's a huge piece of why this loose deosphere has occurred on Twitter, right? Like, we have 140, 280 character chunks of self-narrative that trickle out honestly over the course of what, like the last 2 years, that the group has sort of roughly cohered a couple thousand accounts. That is almost the perfect definition of emergence, right? Like you have these slow, subtle interactions, chunks of story, people build better and better models of each other over time. Sometimes people overshare and a big chunk of their self-narrative suddenly becomes clear. But it's not this one info dump that borders on that like pure ideological imposition of frame. It's been a much more emergent conversation. And I think that honestly, that presents its own issues, right? Because if this is a good example of how you keep a bunch of different ideologies roughly cohered, if we're all expecting some form of collapse, calamity, massive inflection, then that would be an argument that we can't stay cohered quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like herding cats.
It is. Or yeah. Or trying to keep leaves in a pile on a windy day, something like that.
Yeah, I mean that's a perfect example too, is right.
Yeah.
Like there's that occasional dispersion, as maybe not like pure schism, but people just realize that their values don't align enough and they stop talking. But they're still roughly aligned with other members of the sphere that maybe they do. So there's like these communication layers through other people, where we like launder our various ideologies closer and closer and closer to our more distant semi-adversaries. And I think that's a big part of it as well.
Yeah, and also what Nate was saying earlier about play. I think this is also a playful arena, and I think that's important. You know, there's an author called Brian Boyd who explores the evolution of narratives, and you know, I like his framing of the idea that, you know, narrative storytelling emerged from, you know, originally our ancestors were communicated through copying each other. You know, if they wanted to if they wanted to transfer knowledge from one person to another, the other person would copy them, until they developed, you know, the ability to make noises and sounds. And although if you like the singing Neanderthal hypothesis, you know, we developed song before we developed actual, you know, sounds and put together and made words with them. But it was really important to narratives developed in that kind of social, pro-social coming together, where people were trading skills. So they were trading facts, but there was also gap in that trading of facts and in terms of skills to be creative, to be innovative. And the person and the individuals that from an evolutionary sense, the individuals that were best at kind of being creative, and maybe telling a story in some way, or, you know, that conferred them with a selective advantage going forward. So play has always been part of these kind of narrative and learning and innovation circles. So I think, you know, that Doomer Optimism, that we can play in these kind of ideas and ideological spaces and disrupt and break apart ideologies and push them together again is really quite interesting. The one this week, that when they were talking about anarchy, don't know if you guys heard that one, which was really interesting because I guess I'm like a lot of other Luddites that just think anarchy is no government at all, until that podcast. And then I was realizing that, you know, anarchy shares a lot with things that I hold dear, which is about localism and networked kind of participatory governance and redundancy. So yeah, so I think play is really important going forward. But so play is really important, but how do we think that narrative could be useful in terms of these, and an attention on narrative could be useful in terms of advancing, if you like, Doomer optimism as a I mean, Doomer optimism isn't really it's just an umbrella, but how could narrative be important in transitioning? Because this is the thing that I'm interested, I guess. How could discussions and personal narratives be important in transitioning from what we have now into something new? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, first I'd say I love like just the idea of the phrase you said. That I just thought, oh, that's neat. The gap between facts, just that little phrase right there makes my imagination sort of light up a little bit. The gap between facts. But to answer your question, I think that stories ultimately, we don't have, in my view, right? We don't have sort of like a useful cultural story that, moves us in a way that can help us meet the challenges that are in front of us. Like, like it's a cacophony of differing at odds stories that are in conflict with one another, and that sort of negate each other and create, just gridlock and conflict and nothing good. It's sort of, I mean, I'm kind of a doomer in the sense that I think we're kind of collectively culturally in a pretty bad spot right now. That's why sort of, we homeschool our kids, and I mean, why we're doing what we're doing. Look around, I'm like, these things are not great. And I think a huge part of that is when we don't understand each other's stories very well at all. And I think if you don't understand the story of someone whom you would presume to want to influence, you have no chance at all. If you don't understand what story, like really understand what story they're operating from. And in order to do that, I would add, in order to really understand someone else's story, you have to respect it. Yeah, you don't have to agree with it, but you have to respect it. If you're just going in to try to understand someone's story so you can undo it, you'll never understand their story, right? Because you're constantly looking at it from your point of view and constantly trying to deconstruct it and constantly trying to undermine it. So you have to have respect for someone else's story and to understand it, and you have to understand it to influence it, right? And so this is tricky here, because if you're just going in with this real manipulative attitude, it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to be real friendly and get this person to tell me their story, and I'm going to trick them into believing something different. That's not going to work. So there's this, like, I believe, genuineness or authenticity that's required. You go in and you to really understand someone else's story, there's this openness that has to happen, and that openness means that I have my ability to have my story changed or rewritten a little bit as well, if I'm open to really understanding your story. And I think it's in that process of being open to one another's story, telling each other how we see things, remaining open to the perspective of that, that the opportunity to have other stories begin to cohere together that aren't the same. My story isn't the same as what it used to be. Yours might not be the same as what it used to be. When there's a real sense of openness, and I think that openness is cultivated by respect. It's cultivated by playfulness. When you're playing with someone, you're open to their perspective. You kind of like, you develop kind of warm feelings, and you become more curious. Curiosity is where stories have a real opportunity to change. Because then you're open. You want to learn, like, what's that? And that openness creates a place for new information. And it's when we really can let new information in, well, then we have to adapt. If this is a truly new fact to me, I have to adapt my story apparatus to accommodate this new fact, right? Change just happened because I had to, because I was open to it and I allowed this fact in, I had to adapt in some way. Maybe it's just a small way, or maybe sometimes it's a bigger way. So I think in this, again, it's relationship, it's interaction, it's openness and curiosity, I think allows for narratives to be able to slowly change.
That's a really good description, I think, and I love the idea of going into a relationship, going into hearing somebody's story with a really open and accepting mind. And it goes back to the idea as well of as Fisher's tests, that, you know, that person, that you shouldn't necessarily seek to influence another person's story, but of course people do. But if your story is plausible and coherent to that other person, somewhere in there they can see, oh yeah, you know, this story, this narrative holds something for them. Because if it doesn't, it just won't land, it won't grow. So it's got to, in that respect, hold something for them. So you've got to, when you engage with narratives on any level, you've got to trust that process to a certain extent. You've got to trust the process and have faith in it, that a good story, a good narrative will find fertile ground and be lifted up. But it's not a, you know, it's not a fast process. And this is the problem, or it is what we perceive the problem, because at the moment we're living under the shadow of collapse and the shadow of the doom. So perhaps taking ourselves out of the doom, the shadow of that doom, of that urgency, and then just trusting that, you know, good stories find their way to fruition in some way or another. But also the idea that narratives are changing all the time. I mean, this is another kind of narrative, or an archetype, if you like, to coin another term, an interesting term. The archetype is that once we've, a kind of utopian archetype, you know, that once we've built it, it will remain in place forever. And the other kind of thing to sort of wrap in and adapt to narratives is the idea that narratives are constantly changing, constantly updating, and actually constantly recycling. So, you know, one of the things,
the ideal.
Sorry?
I mean, in the ideal.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the terms that gets bandied about online right now, is that NPC. And I think that's deeply unfair to a lot of people, but I do think that points at that sort of rigidity of self-narrative. There are people who have adopted the character and the archetype is set, and it's stopped updating. And I think that's one of those things that we can point at as being a challenging thing to overcome. I think a lot of people have stopped granting the validity of other people's narratives. And I think that's when that NPC gets thrown about as just a, like, I am contracting you down to the smallest set of your beliefs that I disagree most strongly with, as a way to dismiss you. But I also think that it is a real phenomenon, which is where we wind up getting into trouble, right?
What I wish that people could understand, who are stuck in that, is how just conflict laden and ultimately boring it is to see the world that way. It's just so much more fun to be playful. It's just so much more fun to be open to other ideas. And this doesn't mean that you can't have conviction, and you can't, you know, really you have conviction in your own stories and in your own experience, but it does mean that, like, if you just feel so defensive, as if you have to defend it at all costs all of the time, it's exhausting and so boring. It's just
Right.
like, this is it, this is all there ever will be, and I have to defend it. It's not a very fun way to live, in my experience.
Right. It's a fundamental insecurity in that narrative. And I think, again, that's where we get into this static ideology that replaces self-narrative. That's fundamentally, it's static, it's brittle, and there's an insecurity underneath it because it's only at best partially authentic to the person. It's a mask, right? Like there's something that they put on that lets them fit in, that works for now. And then it becomes rigid, and it's scary to remove it, and it's scary to question it. And then nobody in that interaction is capable of transcending that dynamic in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So I wonder, like, what is it that like, what is that an insecurity? I'm sure it's probably different for everyone. I'm just like, what is that? What's underneath that insecurity? What's underneath that fear that is held so rigidly that I can't adapt, I can't be open to another idea? Like, what's at stake?
I mean, I think on some level, it's just, at least personally speaking, it's hard to construct a meaningful self-narrative. At least in this day and age, for me, I can say that was a long process of introspection and challenge and iteration. I can't speak to whether that's always been hard. I imagine it has. But I would say a big piece of that for a lot of people, I would imagine, is that it's just a really challenging thing. And we take shortcuts in that process. And that's where those ideologies and errors start to plug in, is that we have these insecurities, we have these unmet needs to belong, and then there's something that offers us a shortcut or the appearance of the thing that we desire, and we can wear it for a little while, and then it starts to just sink into us, right?
I bet it has been. I bet it is harder. I don't know. This is idle speculation, of course, but I bet it is harder today. I can imagine, if you, I can imagine a time of, like, say, more intact community, basically, like, you know who you are because you have that reflected back to you so often by so many different people in such a consistent way. You know who you are socially, you know who you are in relation to your environment, in relation to the work and the tasks that you do. That it isn't that you don't have to work so damn hard to construct a story to make sense of the world around you that competes with other stories, that rises above the din of all the other stories. That you mentioned belonging. You don't have to construct a story so that you can belong to a particular tribe. You just adopt the story that is handed to you by a tribe or a community or people that you know and trust, and you don't have to. You get to be a part of it, right? Your interaction, the data that is collected by you interacting with your world, becomes a part of your community story and a part of the story that your community tells. But it is a already coherent story, as opposed to, I think today it's just, I gotta create this entire mythology around my life to make sense of anything,
Right.
So,
I think that's so spot
joke
on.
Sometimes. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's so spot on. I absolutely agree. I was thinking along the same lines myself. This kind of, we have to construct ourselves out from the ground in this kind of individualistic society where everything is open. It's kind of postmodernism, really, isn't it? That idea that all meaning is intangible and open for constant renegotiation. Whereas if you're in a tribal setting, or if you're in a strongly religious setting, as people were before, the Industrial Revolution, and in smaller scale societies, I think this is really important, that you didn't have to continually reconstruct yourself. It's tiring.
Yeah, totally. I think that's honestly part of where my optimism comes in, though, is that like you look at those past societies, and there's also a fundamental brittleness to those narratives. There's a massive shadow there of the person who is unseen by the social narrative, the part of you that cannot find expression. And we have this massive potential, I think, now to like I think I was saying when we first discussed having this podcast, we have this opportunity to create massively more granular self narratives and identities and pastiche these archetypes together into something that's much more authentic to the person as opposed to the character that you're playing within the society. And I think, this is probably the most woo thing that I will say, but I think that kind of semantic manipulation of reality found its expression in the past as a form of magic. That's what shamans did. That's what priests did, is that they manipulated the narrative of the people around them and themselves. And I think we at least have the potential to all now tap into that, because our social fabric is just completely destroyed, right? We've leveled so many of those, I don't know, erasing unifiers, that now there's this opportunity that is massively hard work. Obviously, it's a challenging thing to step up and be like, yeah, okay, we're all shamans now. We all construct narrative playfully and magically, and manipulate reality. Cool, that's easy. But I do think that there's a really interesting potential there.
Yeah,
Yeah, so if anything,
sorry.
you're creating you're creating a context for that to occur, right? It's not so much that then it's like, no, we're not focused on what the story is. We're focused on creating a sort of a social context in which that narrative can be created.
Yeah, and for me that links back to the kind of narrative definitions. So narrative is both a verb and a noun. So a narrative is a thing, but it's also a verb. It's a process. It's a doing and constructing process as you go along. So, and I think what we're talking about here is undermining that kind of narrative as a noun, when it conforms to ideology, and much more kind of linking with narrative as a verb, as a kind of tool to construct our social realities going forward. It's the underlying tool for constructing our social realities, really, going forward. But I would challenge to a certain, reach out and challenge to a certain extent that idea that we can and should create narratives of our own, individual choosing. I think the one really interesting thing about narratives of the past is this kind of the collective narrative that was there, that you were born into. And there's a real tension here, isn't there, between narratives of the past, or of this collective narrative that you didn't have any choice over, versus the kind of more individualistic approach that we have now, where you can sort of weave any narrative or any idea into your kind of personal constellation of narratives. You can become whatever narratives you should wish. And I wonder, and I don't know the full answer to this, but in my own interrogation of what it means to live a good life, and what it means to be sustainable, is this idea of sustainability is all about limits to growth, or it should be at its foundation. We need to limit some of our impacts upon the environment and upon society. And in order to do that kind of large scale narratives of meta narrative or grand narrative has to be scaled down towards our own lives. So, is part of the dialogue in Doomer Optimism about limits on our own choices, the own narratives that we necessarily live by. But that might scale up as a kind of huge diversity, because narratives are going to be locally very diverse. It's, you know, you're not going to have one narrative or a solution, because that's kind of other interpretation of narratives. I think it's a kind of solution space for a way of living and interpreting the world. But are we, you know, we're going to have a huge diversity, but each of us isn't going to have necessarily a diversity of choices. We'll have to limit the narratives that we attest to, I guess.
You know, I'm going to reference the I don't know, the Doomer Optimism spiritual grandfather here, Wendell Berry.
We had to get him in.
And yeah, it's not hard for me to usually, but you know, because to me, you know, what we're talking about in a way is community, which is what he writes about. And there's this balance between, you know, the limits imposed by a community, you know, like that sense of you getting that story. This is who I am. This is how it's reflected back to me. And, you know, that is, I think, actually pretty liberating, because like I referenced, you don't have to have this burden of creating, you know, your entire personal self mythology, you know, but it is limiting as well. And I think, you know, Brendan, as you pointed out, you know, there are these shadow aspects, or these aspects that don't fit, and, you know, and what happens there. And I think, you know, a lot of his, I'm thinking of a particular story that he wrote in Port William, because I love all his Port William stories. But he talks about, one of my favorite characters is Burley Coulter, who is described, you know, at some points as wayward, right? He doesn't quite fit and doesn't quite play by the normal social mores of the town of Port William. You know, in his story of making, you know, more of a meaning making process for him outside of the community, but also then finding a way to integrate that and to still be a member of that community. So seeing how, you know, a healthy community has to both have its story and its way of telling its story about itself to itself, right? But also then accommodating individual people who don't just, you know, who like sometimes, you know, that doesn't make much of a ripple, but some people they just for whatever reason need to make a very big splash and need to have like they don't fit. And how does that become accommodated in the story of the place, in the story of a people? There's this really just talking about this tension between group solidarity and individual, you know, individuality.
Yeah, and that's a really nice tale, and I love your interpretation of that. And you know, it makes me think about something that there was a study that was done on the details are sketchy in my head at the moment, but it was a study done in North America on communities and their political views. And you see people coming out, you know, right and left. If you ask them what their political what they voted for in the last election, and they'll come out right or left, and there's certainly a division there. But then if you actually ask them questions about, you know, helping people in society, or, you know, helping your neighbor, or you know, what does it mean to be a good, what does it mean to live the good life, or, you know, just these really kind of basic narratives about how they live their life, those divisions start to disappear quite a lot. You know, people actually act very similarly when you look at their behaviors rather than their kind of the ideological way that they would vote. And I think that's reflected in your story there, because I think when a community pulls together or comes together, narratives of acceptance emerge within those societies, which if you look to that society overall, you could probably kind of you wouldn't necessarily think that would happen. So people make individual accommodations or even group accommodations for people that are seen as outsiders. but you wouldn't necessarily expect that from a kind of overall snapshot. So that kind of ongoing narrative is really important for describing the behavior of a group of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think under healthy circumstances, the community obviously finds a way to resolve that tension in favor of not stagnating, right?
Yeah.
But I definitely think if you look at the past, there are a lot of societies that have failed to do that, and I think that's one of the things that I think I'm pointing at when I say, like, I see a lot of this fracturing as a fulfillment, but we also see a lot of people falling short of that because it is hard. And I don't know. I push back against the idea that societies find a way to accommodate their own outliers. There's a lot of instances of that not being the case. And so, there's the Boo Radleys and all of these stories that we have about the people who are just then overlapped enough to be tolerated, and then there's all of the people that there are no stories about because they were othered completely, and never found integration. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, can the that person's story be accommodated? And in some places, maybe that the story is one that's so powerful and carries benefits, and it actually manages to change the story, the grander narrative of the entire community. But maybe some stories don't fit at all. And I mean, I think then we're talking about like madness. Or we're talking about just then repression of certain ideas, like then it is like that's the margins, that's the we can't integrate this. There's something mad or morally wrong or bad about this particular story that we can't find a place for.
Yeah, and it is, I guess it is the darker side of narratives in that some of them can be, particularly dark and nasty and also focused on othering other peoples or ideas to the detriment of a large number of people. And I think this tension between sort of localism and globalism as well. We tend to want to. So the idea of universal human rights, for instance, as a narrative or as a thing that's really very, very desirable across the spectrum. And how do we keep managing that kind of expectation of society on a much smaller local level, because if we allow, for instance, communities to develop their own, if communities develop their own narratives about social organization and who they accept within a community and who they don't, then it's going to, without some kind of central overarching control or control of that narrative, then that could be quite problematic. But on the other hand, that's just presuming that overarching narrative is going to be a good one. When it's something like Nazism or something like that's controlling the story, controlling the narrative, it can be we know the consequences of that. So it can be a really difficult space to play in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's Boy, this is the question. This is where the rubber hits the road with localism. It's like, are you a localist or are you a universalist that wants, localism for your stuff, but not for other people's stuff?
Yeah.
That's where it gets really hard.
Yeah.
And I think you have to, where I am more and more landing, is you just have to allow as much, even if you don't agree with it, as much local custom to develop as possible. And I think within as broad parameters as possible. I mean, public and ensure freedom of mobility, maybe. I don't know. It's a very hard problem.
I think that the tricky thing is just, if you if you sample human society over 10, 15,000 years, right? Like all of these ways of being human have worked in some location for some set of people over some number of generations. That's been a valid solution. And I think it's really hard to provide space for that tension of like, I think whales are probably really, really smart, but also I think that making sure nobody knows how to hunt whales with bow and harpoons is a bad idea, because at some point in some place that has been a crucial way to know how to be a human and survive. And so we have that tension of not eradicating ways of being that are valid, despite the fact that they feel like they might not be valid right now, with the understanding that at some point they might be again. We might want people who know how to harvest blubber from a creature that might be pretty darn sentient. I don't know.
Isn't this where there's this story? This is a trope, isn't it, in all kinds of fantasy and science fiction and just stories generally? Is like we can call it the control story, and man, that is or the ring of power story, right? Like it's right there. It's like I want my story to be the story.
Yeah.
I want my story to be the story, and I want to enforce that story on everyone else because it's the right story. And it's sort of like this dark narrative it's an I mean it's I think we're back to talking about ideology really, but it's very potent. It's hard to say nope, no, that's not, I'm not in control of that. And that I mean, we love the control story so much. I live here in West Central Illinois, and I mean, you drive around in the summertime, and it's just amazing. The agriculture is just it's just a monument to human control. I mean, everything perfect rows as far as the eye can see, no weeds, one species. It's just a monument to control, control of the environment, control of, it's harvested at one, like it's just control. And man, that's a story that we are infatuated with.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. And one of the biggest meta narratives, grand narratives that we have is this story of control over nature, that for me stems from and also control over story, control over creating an image of the world that is only about facts, that has been the dialogue, the narrative since the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an ushering off of religious constraints on about the world. We know that the world is created by God. It operates on this hierarchy of God, and then Lord, and then lord of the manor, and then peasant at the bottom, with the bishops in there. So that's your position. And the Enlightenment was a response to that, in terms of, trying to break up, or trying to base an understanding of what the world is much more on observable facts. And so since the Enlightenment, we've got further and further down this reductionist approach to the world, to the point now that everything about, in the West anyway, or the global North, everything is about reduction and siloing and narratives of data-driven understanding. And we've lost that connection to story, and to a more holistic vision of the world. And one of the things that I feel about story is that it's although it still uses words and narratives, which in themselves are kind of reductionist to a certain extent, stories give a snapshot of the whole in a much better way than data points on a graph. So, there's a lot of work that's being done out there on narratives as a way of kind of understanding complexity and understanding that the kind of holism, if you like, the whole picture through narratives. And I think that regaining this balance of wanting to control things by understanding it through reduction, and letting things go, and having a trust that there is your narrative fits into the wider unification, the wider holism of the earth, and what's going on with it, is certainly something that I think human beings have to find a narrative about, if you like. And I think we can learn from indigenous people.
You said trust. You said trust, and the whole time that you were talking before that, I was just thinking that this control mindset was just, I'm like, it's just this form of faithlessness.
Yeah.
Utter faithlessness.
Yeah.
I talk about this stuff, and it makes me feel I'm not I'm not personally, I don't belong to a particular religion, but I talk about this stuff, and it always points me into feeling very religious, and it's kind of a personal nightmare for me, to be honest with you. Yeah, it's something I get very stuck on that hump.
Well, it can be difficult. I know a lot of people at the moment who are difficult. It's not difficult. It's just a different approach to the world, and I know a number of people who are converting to Christianity, people that I never thought I'd see converting, like Paul Kingsnorth, and there's the other mythologist guy, whose name escapes me at the moment. But yeah, that sense of trust, that or faith perhaps in this kind of holistic picture. And I think that's where reductionism is almost like a fear-based, we don't really understand the world, so we have to take it apart in order to know it. But now we have to be engaged in putting it together. And I do think narratives and storytelling have a really important part to play in that, because it's like, even when you go back to Plato and the his focus on logos and logic in the expense of mythos or storytelling and poetry. We've been on that kind of line for maybe 2,000 years now, and it's really important to turn back and have a look at narrative as a way of understanding and meeting the world. But yeah, it's not fraught without difficulties.
Yeah.
Do
you think there's something about, like, I just think, and I think a lot of people in the DO sphere may relate in some point, because there's such a focus on growing things, growing food, eh, plants, animals, growing life. And the further you get from that, and the more easy it is to forget. You put a seed in the ground and it's fucking miraculous that it comes up. And just the way that life reproduces itself when you do it all the time, and you just maintain, like, it's so fundamentally irreducible and magical and just sort of miraculous. At least I experience it that way all the time, that the further distance you get from that, the more you can feel like you have to do it yourself. You have to control it. Or it can be done. It can be controlled, instead of like just this. I mean, I use this term, I say magical, just only in a way, to me, it just eludes me. that's all.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if there's just something there. The further you get from that direct experience of food, of life reproducing itself, and being able to see it and experience it, and trying to cultivate it, but also understanding really that it's you're not doing it. You're not putting the life in there.
Yeah, and I think that is really important, because um, that physical embodiedness of that relationship with the earth has been vital for our narratives, for the structure of our narratives. And I think as we move away from that into more virtual spaces and more abstract spaces, it's going to affect the kinds of narratives that we produce. And the conversations that we have. So narratives are going to be, the stories that we tell are going to be less concretely built around kind of the physical structures that we have experience of have had experience of every day, up to the point of, but now we can talk about, our stories are full of avatars, and our narratives are full of avatars and virtual reality and gaming, and the possibilities that are endless in that space. But that's just the realm of ideas. It's not like the physical realm as such. So maybe one of the important things, and this is certainly why I teach workshops on things like spoon carving and scything and hedge laying. And because I believe that in order to readjust our narratives of respect and connection to the earth, we need to re-experience the earth and have re-narrify, if you like, our connection to the earth. So that's really,
I said also to recomplexify, right? Like you have traditional farming is a vastly simplified system that bears almost no relationship to nature as a whole, and then we have this permaculture movement, which is replicating complexity and minutia. And I think in some ways we're talking about exactly the same process for a narrative. We have these small tribal hyper-tailored narratives that have worked for Dunbar multiples for a long time. Then we have this greater society that's a much more imposed, rigid, inflexible, and static narrative of a people. And now we're trying to do exactly the same thing. We're trying to bring complexity back to personal expression and what it means to be human.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. That's, it's funny. You move out. I mean, I had this experience 10 years ago. We moved back here, And there's this cliche of like, kind of re-embracing the simple life. And it's like, that's hilarious.
Yeah. Like, oh, you must be
Like,
so relaxed out here. No.
it's like you have to learn how to do so many more things. You have to be able to interact. Like it's recomplexifying. It's not simplifying. That's not what's happening. You're taking those complex relationships in, and instead of outsourcing. Wendell Berry talks about this in The Unsettling of America, a lot, about this, recomplexifying. I think I'm glad you brought that up. That's and it's so much more in touch with that's why grounding as much as we can about our stories. To go back to that initial, I think you said making, you have the direct sensory at the beginning of the conversation, but you said the direct sensory experiencing, and then the layer of sense making, and then the ideological layer beyond that. And then the further you get away from direct experience, the more abstract and the more rigid, these stories become, because they're not tied directly to something actual anymore. They're just
There's
they're
more
just
friction
ideas.
every time you step out.
Yes, and I think about that again. What I was saying earlier, you think about that on the farm, and how so many of our popular idioms, metaphors, ways of speaking are agricultural in nature, and being on the farm and then seeing those things like firsthand. That's why people have always said that. Don't cry over spilled milk. You always think of like you always think of a kid spilling the cup, or at least I did. 15 years ago, I thought about a kid spilling their milk. Don't cry over spilled milk. And that's not what that means. It means you get up at 5 a.m. and you're milking your cow, and the cow kicks the bucket over, and that sucks, and like you can feel that, like it's a direct, like that's what that means. Or the fact that like the stereotypical name for a cow is often bossy, and then you get to know a cow's personality, and like that's why cows are called bossy. I mean, I have one of our best cows out there. She's just a bossy animal. She will yell in your face and tell you when it's time to feed her. She's cranky. It's like, you're named Bossy. I see that. And those are stories that are resonant because they are anchored in the actual.
Yeah, and I mean, even the very words we use to describe meaning and meaning making or getting meaning are physical. We talk about, I can't grasp that. I want to be able to grasp an idea. So that's, it's a physical manifestation, we're using words that we would use to describe physical actions when we're talking about ideas as well. So, the way we think and the way we construct languages is very much predicated still in that kind of real physical space. So I think it's important to get back to that, or at least to remind ourselves of that. I'm just in the process at the moment of constructing a bid for a couple of courses at the University of Waterloo, which will do. So we'll do this basket weaving and spoon carving and things like that. So it's a kind of antidote, if you like, to while people are taking in all this information and becoming, expanding their cognitive awareness, they're also expanding their embodied cognition by reminding themselves that their bodies think and act as well. So
it's simultaneously grounding and dynamic. One of the things I think that's interesting to bear in mind too is that, like, this is one cycle of time, and what we have often seen is there's this period of recomplexifying, grounding, introduction of dynamism that then becomes rigid once more. Right? So like 1 or 2 generations down the road, I think it's really helpful to remind ourselves that we're going to be having this exact conversation. Where there is formerly dynamic people who have become conservative and static, and there's going to be people who are saying it's time to recomplexify. You don't understand the whole.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I'd have to get in something that Jason Snyder's really fond of, which is the kind of adaptive cycle and in resilience as well. That idea that, you know, we're in a going up into the, you know, if you imagine an infinity figure, we're kind of in going into that. We are in that forward loop of conservation, and we're going to drop out of it, and things are going to break apart, and we're going to be in this new back loop of creativity, you know. So we keep cycling around in these kind of adaptive cycles of creation and destruction within our society, and we'll come back to this place again and again. I'm sure about that, but it'll all be just subtly different because we're working with different, you know, seeds, if you like, of construction. I'm conscious, gentlemen, of the time. We've been at this for an hour and a half now. How do people feel? Do you think we're at a stage to sort of call it a day, or do you got any other burning things you want to discuss? I think we've covered quite a lot in this podcast. I think we probably have another one.
Productive ground, yeah,
definitely. I mean, you know, it's my intention as a, you know, a student of this narrative approach to sort of have ongoing conversations with people, and you know, I'd love to come back and have another chat with you guys at some point. Keep the conversation flowing. Maybe revisit some of these things we've talked about when we've mulled them over a little bit more.
Yeah, that sounds fun. I guess I'm just going to say the thoughts that, to be reductionist, that are reduced from this is, you know, the importance of being in relationship with the people we're interacting with, playing and having fun, and then getting your hands dirty in the real world. Like, these are all things that if we're kind of, you know, looking to create and interact with each other's narratives in productive ways, if we have this if we have fun with it. And I try to say that all the time on Twitter, like, hey, this has got to be fun, or what are we doing here? Like, I'm not here to fight, I'm not here to like, that's, you know, so play, have fun, get your hands dirty in the real world, and treat interactions as relationships, not transactions.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely, Nate. You know, I was going to also sort of draw attention to that idea of even before you engage in the narrative, just step back and think about how you're going to engage, and be kind, and don't step in to expect to change someone's mind. You know, if your idea is good, or if you're, you know, if it's something that people can be receptive to, and it's a building block, it will build. You know, you've got to trust the narrative process, perhaps, is what I'd say in summary. Any thoughts from you, Brendan? Final.
No, I mean, there's a lot to think about in this conversation. I I honestly look forward to when the recording drops, so that I can think about it a little bit more.
Said. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great. Well, thanks guys. Really excellent conversation, and look forward to catching up with you again in the future. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Cheers for now.
Have a good one, guys.
Yeah.